A 10-year-old girl awakens from a coma and tells her mother something horrifying. Upon hearing it, she is in utter disbelief. Emily's eyes slowly fluttered open. Everything felt hazy and distant, as if she were surfacing from a very long dream. The stark white hospital lights were blinding, and the sound of the machines all around her created a rhythm that was both monotonous and strangely comforting. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. It was all so confusing, as if she had been whisked away to some unfamiliar place, even though a small part of her mind knew she was in a hospital. The pain in her body was a dull ache, a kind of constant, gentle throbbing, but it was bearable. And yet, the feeling that unsettled her most wasn't the physical pain. It was the fear, a fear that had been her companion since long before the accident. A silent dread was growing in the deepest part of her soul, like a shadow that stalked her, even if she couldn't remember the reason why. Beside her, her mother, Sarah, was asleep in a stiff, uncomfortable chair. Sarah's face was etched with the signs of sleepless nights, with deep, dark circles under her eyes, and the clear traces of exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Her mother was holding Emily's small hand firmly, as if that physical connection was the only thing keeping her sanity intact. When Sarah felt her daughter's subtle movement, she jolted awake, her heart pounding with hope and relief. She looked at the little girl, her eyes filling with tears as she realized that Emily was finally waking up. "Emily, my love, are you awake?" Sarah said, her voice cracking with emotion as she leaned closer to her daughter, holding Emily's delicate face between her hands with infinite softness. It was as if she was afraid of hurting her, as if this moment was as fragile as a dream that could vanish at any second. Emily wanted to smile. She wanted to tell her mother that she was okay, that everything would be all right now that she had returned. But something inside her was preventing it. It wasn't just the pain that constantly ran through her body, as if every muscle was slowly reawakening after weeks of inactivity. It was something far more profound, a sense of deep-seated discomfort she had no words for. In that twilight state between sleep and reality, a presence, a shadowy memory, seemed to hover over her thoughts, almost as if it had become a part of her very being. She couldn't shake it, and had no idea how to even begin to speak of what she'd overheard just before the crash. Her mind slowly drifted back to the accident. Fragments of what had happened began to surface, like pieces of a painful puzzle she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to solve. She remembered being in the car next to her mother. It was a rainy night, the roads slick with water, and the visibility was dangerously low. Sarah was driving cautiously, just as she always did, especially whenever Emily was in the car. They had spent the day together, shopping and making plans for the weekend, chatting about the simple, everyday things that made up the life of a mother and daughter. And yet, something had been troubling Emily even before she got into the car, a nagging sense of unease, as if something terrible were about to happen. Now, a specific moment surfaced in her memory. Richard, her stepfather, on the phone. His voice had been strangely low and controlled, almost chillingly cold, something she had never noticed before. The words she'd overheard, accident and take care of everything, echoed in her mind, but at the time, she had simply dismissed them. But now, awake and with fragments of memory rushing back, those words took on a new, ominous meaning. A sense of high alert coursed through her body, as if suddenly everything made a terrifying kind of sense. At the time, she hadn't thought anything of it. After all, Richard was her mother's husband, the man who had taken care of them for the past few years. But now, those words seemed to hold a new and sinister meaning. Emily had wanted to tell her mother what she'd overheard, but before she ever got the chance, the accident happened. The memories were coming back in fast, disordered flashes. The sound of tires screeching across the wet asphalt, her mother screaming something she couldn't make out, and then the impact. The sound of twisting metal, the crunch of shattering glass, and then silence. The kind of silence that exists only between life and death. She didn't know for certain how her mother had survived. She remembered feeling her body being thrown inside the car, and then darkness. But now, as she looked at Sarah, her mother's worried expression revealed the truth that she still didn't fully comprehend. They had survived. That seemingly fatal accident hadn't ended their lives. But at what cost? Something was wrong. She knew it, even if she couldn't explain it. And the figure of Richard, his presence, was what terrified her the most now. "Are you in pain?" Sarah asked, her voice still trembling as she tried to remain calm. Emily shook her head slightly, her eyes fixed on her mother's. It wasn't physical pain that was troubling her. It was something deeper, something harder to put into words. Sarah watched her daughter with a growing sense of unease. The fact that Emily was awake was nothing short of a miracle. But there was something different in the way the child looked at her. It wasn't merely the confusion of someone waking from a coma. There was fear. A deep fear in Emily's eyes, a terror that Sarah couldn't comprehend, but one that chilled her to the bone. "It's all right, my love. You are safe now." Sarah tried to soothe her daughter, stroking her face tenderly. But Emily knew she wasn't safe at all. She knew something terrible was on the verge of happening. Something that Richard had planned. She felt an overwhelming urge to speak. But she couldn't manage to find the proper words. How could she possibly explain something so dreadful? How could she tell her mother that the very man she trusted, the one who was meant to protect them, was actually plotting something unspeakable? Sarah fought to hold back her tears as she saw her daughter looking so fragile and lost in the hospital bed. Her small body was covered in bandages, and Emily's face, who had always been so vibrant, now appeared pale and tired. The days she spent beside her daughter's bed were the longest and most terrifying of her life. With each passing hour, Sarah felt hope slipping right through her fingers. The accident had been brutal, and she herself was still recovering from the physical and emotional wounds. Whenever Sarah closed her eyes, flashes of the crash would rush back into her mind like a nightmare that refused to go away. The night was particularly rainy, and the road was dark and slippery. She remembered driving with caution, her fingers gripping the steering wheel firmly, while Emily, in the back seat, was humming a children's song playing on the radio. Everything seemed normal until the moment something went terribly wrong. The sound of tires sliding on the wet asphalt still echoed in her head, followed by the frightening sensation of the car losing control. The glare from the headlights of a vehicle traveling in the opposite direction. The lights flashed over and over in her memory, searing an image that blinded her before the crash. Sarah could barely piece together what happened after that single, horrific instant. The sound of glass exploding into 1,000 pieces, Emily's scream being abruptly silenced, and the brutal collision that sent their bodies reeling. It felt as though the world around her had burst into a storm of chaos, leaving nothing behind but agonizing pain and suffocating darkness. The sense of an ending was almost a certainty in that moment. Sarah prepared for the absolute worst, convinced this was her final breath. When the car finally ground to a halt, she was stunned and drenched in blood, with no idea whether she was among the living or the dead. Her body felt pinned and consumed by pain, and the last thing she recalled before slipping into unconsciousness was the deafening silence that had settled over everything. No sound from Emily, no sign that she was still breathing. But there she was, her daughter, alive. She was visibly, deeply affected. Emily, who had survived against all conceivable odds, stared back at Sarah with an expression in her eyes she couldn't begin to understand. It was a gaze that mingled fear, uncertainty, and a sorrow far too heavy for a 10-year-old child. Sarah drew closer to the bed, her fingers gently stroking Emily's hair, attempting to quiet the unease she felt growing within her. "Sweetheart, are you in pain now? Is anything bothering you?" Sarah whispered, her voice soft and sweet. Emily did not respond immediately. There was something in the little girl's eyes that worried her profoundly. She was alert, but seemed to be searching for something or someone around her, as if she were still in danger. Sarah could see that the fear had not passed. In fact, it seemed even stronger now that her daughter had awakened. "Mom." Emily's voice broke the silence, weak and hesitant, as though the words were trapped in her throat. Each syllable seemed like an internal battle as Sarah leaned in closer to listen, her own face a mask of anticipation and fear. "What is it, my love?" Sarah's question came out gently, but with a note of urgency, while her heart pounded forcefully in her chest. She was braced for anything, or so she believed. But deep down, she sensed that what her daughter was about to say would change everything. Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling. What she was on the verge of saying could shatter the world they knew, but the weight of the truth was heavier than her fear. "I heard," she began, her voice quivering, and Sarah felt her stomach churn with anxiety. "I heard Richard." Sarah furrowed her brow. She never expected her husband's name to surface at a moment like this. Richard, who was at home, always seemed so worried about Emily's condition. He had been a constant presence throughout the entire ordeal, visiting the hospital regularly, calling several times a day to get updates on his stepdaughter's recovery. They had been married for 3 years, and from the very beginning, Richard had presented himself as an attentive partner, someone who had brought stability into their lives. Sarah couldn't fathom why Emily would bring up Richard, especially not right now. "What did you hear, sweetie?" Sarah asked, struggling to keep her composure. Emily took a deep, shuddering breath, visibly uncomfortable, as though every word she spoke was a painful shard of glass. She glanced down at her own hands for a moment before finally meeting Sarah's eyes again. "I overheard him, planning an accident for us." Emily's voice cracked as her eyes welled with tears, but she pressed on. "He wanted us to die, Mom." A wave of ice-cold shock washed over Sarah, leaving her utterly paralyzed. Her mind refused to process her daughter's words. She leaned forward, the frantic beat of her heart thundering in her ears. How could that possibly be true? Richard, the man she trusted, who had been her rock after Emily's father died, was being accused of something so monstrous by her own child. A mother's instinct screamed at her to believe Emily. But reason fought back, desperately trying to find an explanation that didn't end in betrayal. But looking into her daughter's eyes, the unyielding certainty swimming in those tears caused her entire world to crumble. Emily's words weren't the product of childish confusion or fear. They sounded like the truth, and that terrified her. "But how is that possible, sweetie? When did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Before the accident. I was in my room," Emily explained, trying to remain calm, although she was clearly still shaken. "He was talking on the phone. I heard him say that it was so we would die." Sarah could barely process the information. Her hands trembled as she held Emily's even tighter, almost as if she needed that physical connection just to stay upright. The words echoed in her mind, struggling to fit into a reality she refused to accept. Richard, her husband, the man who promised to protect them, could be involved in something so monstrous. How could that be possible? He had been by her side the entire time after the accident, always acting so concerned and affectionate. How could he? The architect of such a monstrous betrayal. "Emily, are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as her heart hammered wildly inside her chest. The little girl just nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. And in that very instant, Sarah knew their lives would never be the same again. Sarah left the hospital that night with a heavy heart and her mind in turmoil. Emily's words echoed relentlessly in her thoughts, stirring up a toxic cocktail of fear, suspicion, and utter disbelief. She couldn't just point the finger at Richard, the man she shared her life with, the one who seemed so devoted to her and their daughter. After all, Emily was only a child. The trauma from the accident could have easily muddled her memories, twisting her perception of something that wasn't even real. But at the same time, there was something in her daughter's voice that rang with sincerity, an unshakable conviction that Sarah simply could not ignore. And what if it was true? What if the man she loved was capable of something so unspeakable? When she finally arrived home, Sarah forced herself to act as if everything was normal, even though on the inside she was completely falling apart. As she opened the door, she saw Richard on the sofa, his expression grave and weary. He looked deeply troubled, as if he too was shouldering the weight of the entire situation. "How is she?" Richard asked, his eyes lifting as he saw Sarah walk in. Sarah froze for a moment, trying to quell the storm that was brewing inside her. She drew in a long, deep breath and replied in the steadiest voice she could muster. "She woke up," she said, fighting to keep the tremble from her voice. Richard's reaction was instantaneous. The faintest hint of a relieved smile touched his lips. "That's wonderful news. I knew she would pull through." He paused, then added, "And is she lucid? Can she talk?" A chill ran through Sarah's entire body. The question caught her completely off guard, sending an icy shiver down her spine. There was something in the way Richard had framed the question, in his slightly strained, almost eager tone, that set off alarm bells in her mind. It was as though he was waiting for one particular answer. What did he think Emily could have possibly said? Trying to mask the growing suspicion that was now churning within her, Sarah took a deep, steadying breath before she replied. "She's still incredibly weak," she said, forcing a casual tone. "The doctors are confident she'll recover, but it's going to take some time. We have to be patient." Richard nodded, his features softening slightly, but Sarah couldn't help but notice the fleeting flicker of relief that flashed across his eyes. A relief that unsettled her to her very core. She knew she had to tread carefully. She couldn't confront him directly, at least not without solid proof. The idea that Richard could be involved in something so monstrous as planning the accident that nearly claimed their lives was a thought she refused to immediately entertain. And yet, at the same time, her daughter's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. Sarah knew that she could not afford to ignore them. In the days that followed, Sarah began to watch Richard with a new intensity. He appeared to be the same man he always was, but now everything he did or said was viewed by her through a thick filter of suspicion. Every gesture, every word spoken with affection was now tainted by a lingering shadow of doubt. She noticed how he would sometimes watch her from the corner of his eye, as if he were constantly measuring her reactions. And even though he was still present, taking care of the house and asking regularly about Emily's condition, Sarah just couldn't shake the ever-growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was at that moment she decided to take action. Installing cameras in the house seemed like the only way to uncover the truth without raising suspicion. If Emily was right, if there was truly something wrong with Richard, at some point the cameras would capture some proof, some conversation, or a hidden plan. If she was mistaken, at least Sarah could finally quiet her heart and push away those dark thoughts that tormented her. The very next day, after Richard had already left for work, Sarah began to meticulously plan where she would place the cameras. It had to be something discreet, something he would never notice. She spent hours studying every corner of the house, picturing how he moved through each and every space, and she selected strategic locations to conceal the cameras. She handled everything with the utmost care, leaving no room for error. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but she had to know the truth. Over the following weeks, Sarah maintained a facade of normalcy, juggling hospital visits with the household routine, acting as if nothing had changed at all. But inside, every single day, was an emotional roller coaster of anxiety. Every time she reviewed the recordings, her heart would pound. It was a strange sensation, as if she was expecting something terrible to happen, while at the same time praying that the whole thing was nothing more than a huge misunderstanding. The daily footage showed a calm Richard going about his daily routine, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to relax, imagining that at any moment something could be revealed. After all, if he was truly planning something, sooner or later, he was bound to slip up. She just hoped she would be ready when he did, for it to happen. 1 week later, Sarah was home alone, reviewing the recordings. The silence of that afternoon felt heavier, almost oppressive. The air was thick with the unseen tension of a truth she was afraid to uncover. With her eyes glued to the monitor, she watched every move Richard made, captured by the cameras. Every recorded image showed her husband going about his daily activities as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Sarah didn't know exactly what she expected to find, but she kept watching, feeling the weight of distrust growing inside her. Then she stumbled upon one particular recording. It was just an ordinary afternoon. Richard was alone in the office. The scene seemed harmless at first, until he picked up the phone. Sarah turned up the volume and leaned closer to the screen, her heartbeat quickening as the tension mounted. There was something in Richard's posture, in the way he spoke in a low, controlled tone, that made her feel a chill run down her spine. What she heard next made her heart stop in its tracks. "This time, there will be no room for error," he said, his voice chillingly calm, as if he were discussing the most trivial of matters. "I'm going to tamper with the car again, but I'll make sure it's a one-way trip." Sarah stood there, completely frozen. Every single word from Richard echoed in her mind, completely eroding any lingering trace of doubt she might have been clinging to. The confirmation was right there, staring her in the face. There was no longer any room for assumptions. He was plotting another accident, scheming to take them out of the picture again. This horrifying discovery was crushing Sarah from the inside out. The man she thought she knew, the one she had welcomed into her life, trusting him with everything she held dear, was not who he pretended to be. His motive was now crystal clear. It wasn't love. It had never been about love. Richard didn't want a family. He wanted the money, the assets, everything Sarah had painstakingly built over the years. He had wormed his way into their lives with a facade of affection and care, but it was all part of a much larger scheme, a plot to seize everything that was rightfully Sarah's, no matter what the cost. And for him, the price to be paid was their lives. Sarah's hands trembled uncontrollably. The air grew thin, difficult to breathe, as though the very space around her was shrinking. She had never in her life felt so vulnerable, so deeply betrayed. All the memories they had made together, the loving touches, the words of solace he'd spoken after the accident, now felt utterly hollow. A mere performance from a man biding his time to make his move. But more than anything, Sarah felt a primal need to protect her daughter. Emily was alive by a miracle. And now, more than ever, Sarah knew she had to move fast to make sure they both stayed that way. In the time that followed, after weeks in the hospital, the day finally arrived for Emily's discharge, bringing a complicated mix of relief and apprehension for Sarah. The little one was still so physically fragile, with several bandages and scars marking her small frame. But the joy of finally returning home was plain to see on her face. For Sarah, however, the return home was much more complex. As she gently helped Emily into the car, she couldn't escape the constant, gnawing tension. As if the entire world, as if everything around her was teeming with invisible threats. The home that once symbolized safety now seemed to be shrouded in darkness. She knew she had to do everything in her power to make Emily feel safe and protected once more. But the silent presence of Richard in their lives was a menace she had yet to figure out how to eliminate entirely. Living under the same roof as Richard became a relentless test of Sarah's resolve. She had already spoken to her daughter, carefully explaining what they knew and begging her, no matter how impossible it seemed, to feign normality around her stepfather. The little one, still terrified by what she had uncovered, tried her best to be brave, but Sarah knew the tension was ever present in their guarded glances and restrained movements. Pretending that nothing was wrong, knowing the peril they were in, was utterly exhausting for them both. But it was essential to make certain that Richard wouldn't suspect a single thing. Every meal they shared, every forced smile, made Sarah feel the crushing weight of the deception they were forced to maintain until the perfect moment to strike. Fear and rage collided violently within Sarah, like two opposing forces that kept her in a state of extreme alert. Her mind was on the verge of collapse, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose control. She needed to act, and fast. The danger was real, and the threat that loomed over her life and Emily's now seemed closer, more tangible. Especially after having heard the plan from Richard with her own ears. The image of him plotting her demise with such coldness and precision was consuming her from the inside. But as much as the rage threatened to take over, Sarah knew that any impulsive move could be catastrophic. If she confronted Richard without concrete proof and without the necessary protection, she would place her life and her daughter's in even greater danger. Her priority was clear: protect Emily. She had to ensure that nothing happened to her daughter. Every second counted, and she could not afford to fail. She knew that Richard didn't suspect that his intentions had been discovered, and that would be her advantage. What she held in her hands, the recordings of his conversations, was irrefutable proof. But it still wasn't enough. She needed to hand them over to the authorities and make sure they caught him red-handed. Without a moment's hesitation, Sarah picked up the phone and called the police. The call was quick and to the point. She explained the situation in clear terms, providing the recordings she had made as evidence, while her heart hammered in her chest. It felt as if at any moment Richard could walk into the room and discover what she was doing. The tension made her break out in a cold sweat. However, she kept her voice steady, knowing her life and her daughter's life depended on it. The authorities, after listening to the evidence she had gathered, immediately planned what would be Richard's arrest in the very act. The plan the police suggested was simple, but it required caution and precision. Sarah and Emily would leave the house that very day under the pretext that they needed to go to the hospital for one of Emily's routine checkups. They wouldn't be going far. They would remain in the vicinity while the police awaited the perfect moment to move in on the house and take Richard into custody. The recordings had already provided more than enough to initiate proceedings, but catching him in the act would guarantee that he could not escape justice. From that point forward, Sarah began to set the plan in motion, acting as naturally as she could. She knew Richard was watching her, so every single movement had to appear spontaneous, completely routine, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Her mind raced to maintain her composure, even as the feeling of urgency swelled inside of her. As they got ready to leave, Richard watched her from the couch, showing no apparent sign of suspicion. He was relaxed, a cup of coffee in his hand, gazing at her, just as he always did whenever she moved about the house. That scene, in a twisted way, seemed to be a reflection of the peaceful and balanced life they were supposed to be living. But now, all Sarah could see was the facade of a cruel man who hid his deadly intentions behind a mask of affection. "I need to take Emily to the hospital," she said, her voice calm and controlled, masking the tension that was consuming her from the inside. This had to appear completely natural, like just another routine errand, something they had done countless times before. "Can you stay at the house for a little while?" "I don't think we'll be too long," she finished, slinging her bag over her shoulder and straightening her jacket while giving Richard one last look. He nodded without a moment's hesitation, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Of course, no problem. I'll stay right here," he answered, wishing them a safe trip with a casualness that made Sarah's skin crawl. Sarah walked out of the house with Emily, trying her best to maintain a serene composure, even though on the inside she felt like she could fall apart at any second. The plan was now in motion. But until the police had Richard in custody, she knew she couldn't let her guard down for a moment. She felt the immense weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Her daughter's safety, their future, everything hinged on this very moment. Once they were in the car, Sarah drove with extreme caution that day. Her heart was pounding, racing with every mile they covered. She had no way of knowing if the car had been tampered with again, and the fear that something was the sheer malice of it all paralyzed her. Once she reached a place of safety, far, far away from Richard, she pulled over and frantically called the police, who arrived on the scene shortly after. The car was immediately towed and sent off for a thorough forensic examination. As they waited anxiously for the results, Sarah and Emily felt the crushing weight of tension grow. Hours later, the police returned with the confirmation they had been dreading. The brake system had been deliberately tampered with. The brakes had been rigged to fail the moment the car reached a high speed, a setup that would have surely ended in a fatal crash. Armed with this damning evidence, the police had everything they needed to arrest Richard red-handed, finally putting a stop to the menace that had been haunting them. A few minutes later, Sarah's phone rang. It was the officer she had spoken with, confirming that the team was about to move in on the house. Sarah squeezed Emily's hand tightly, trying her best to contain her overwhelming anxiety. There was no turning back now. Richard, the man she had entrusted with her life and that of her daughter, he was about to be arrested. The sense of relief was mixed with the sorrow and the sheer shock of betrayal. Sarah knew that in a moment, her life would be changed forever. From that point on, she and Emily would finally be free from the nightmare. When the police arrived at Richard's house, he was sitting in the living room, relaxed, immersed in a false sense of victory. His mind was at ease, confident that the plan he had so carefully orchestrated had already come to fruition. He imagined that by now, Sarah and Emily were dead, victims of another accident he had engineered meticulously to appear fatal. For him, life was about to change. The money, the assets, all of Sarah's inheritance would be his. What he never expected was the outcome that awaited him that day. When he heard the doorbell ring, Richard rose with a faint smile on his face, already imagining it would be someone from the police or the hospital, bringing the tragic news he was coldly anticipating. He casually walked toward the door and opened it without a moment's hesitation. However, instead of being met with the devastating news about the death of his wife and stepdaughter, what Richard found was a team of police officers standing on his doorstep, poised to arrest him. The smirk on Richard's face instantly vanished. His eyes, which moments before held such confidence, now betrayed a rising tide of confusion. The team leader, a tall and stern-faced officer, took a step forward and with an unreadable expression announced, "Richard Coleman, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and for tampering with a vehicle." Richard stumbled backward, the color draining from his face as the officer's words began to sink in. His first impulse was one of complete and utter disbelief. "What? This is a mistake," he protested, his voice beginning to rise. "You have no idea what you're talking about." He held up his hands, gesturing desperately, as if trying to push away this impossible, unfolding reality. How did they find out? A panicked thought screamed in his mind. The officer didn't even flinch. With a calm, mechanical motion, he pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and walked towards Richard, who at that very moment began to take nervous steps backward, trying to buy himself some time, as if he could somehow escape the situation with just his words. "It's a mistake," he insisted, his voice now trembling. "I would never do something like that." His hands were shaking, but there was no longer any way to avoid the inevitable. "We have proof, Mr. Coleman," the officer said coldly, leaving no room for Richard to continue defending himself. "Recordings of your conversations and an expert report confirming the tampering with your wife's vehicle? There is no mistake." The mention of the recordings was like a gut punch to Richard. He stopped moving, and for a moment he stood frozen, his eyes wide open. Recordings. They had recordings. How was that possible? In his mind, the plans had been carefully crafted, with no room for error. He had taken every single precaution, or so he had believed. Richard tried to argue one last time, his voice now faltering, barely more than a whisper. "You're all making a terrible mistake. There's no evidence." But the officers were already closing in on him. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut on his wrists was the final echo of everything he had lost. As he felt the cold metal constrict his wrists, a dreadful realization began to dawn on Richard. There was no escape. The plan had failed. Worse still, he was now completely exposed. As they escorted him toward the squad car, Richard's mind was racing frantically. He tried to grasp for an explanation, some way to justify what had just transpired. He tried to convince himself that this was all a misunderstanding, and that somehow he would manage to free himself from these accusations. And yet, with every single step he took, the reality of it all crashed down on him even harder. Sarah and Emily were not gone. They had escaped. Everything he had so meticulously planned for weeks, all the cold precision with which he had carried out his intentions, had all been for nothing. As they ushered him into the back of the squad car, Richard caught one final glimpse of the street. It was deserted, utterly silent. There were no cries of desperation, no sirens announcing tragedies in the distance. In that moment, he knew Sarah and Emily were safe. The fact that he had not accomplished his goal, that his attempts to end their lives had failed, was the final, crushing blow to his pride. As the police car began to move, Richard fixed his gaze on the window, his body tense with rage and the sting of failure. Right up until the very last second, he had believed he could deceive everyone, that his plan was infallible. But the truth was something else entirely. He had been caught, defeated by the woman he underestimated, and by the little girl he never considered a threat. The silence inside the patrol car was cutting. Every movement of the vehicle pulled him further away from his former life, from his freedom, and from any glimmer of hope he still harbored. The future he had attempted to build on a foundation of lies and violence was crumbling to dust. All that was left now was the void and the certainty that he would finally pay for what he had done. Deep down, even with his pride shattered and frustration consuming his mind, Richard knew that he had lost. No excuse could save him now. The man who had always meticulously planned his life, who believed he could control everything around him, was now being led away to prison, defeated by his own actions. Sarah was determined to start a new life with Emily. Now that Richard was behind bars, he could no longer harm them. But a part of her was still trying to understand the true reasons behind Richard's monstrous actions. Though greed seemed like the obvious motive, she sensed there was something much deeper. Her nights were filled with questions, as she tried to piece together how she had ever become involved with someone capable of such cruelty. Then, one day, while sorting through old financial documents and papers from the past, Sarah made a discovery that shed a new and terrifying light on everything that had occurred. In a folder, hidden deep in the back of an office cabinet, she discovered documents that connected Richard to a company that had gone bankrupt years earlier, long before they had ever met. As she read further, her heart began to pound, as she recognized a name that froze her in place. It was her own father's. The company where Richard had worked as a manager had failed catastrophically, and her father, one of the investors, had also borne a share of the responsibility for that collapse. The documents revealed that while her father wasn't the only one to blame, he had made reckless investment decisions and had influenced some of the managers to follow a path that ultimately drove the company into ruin. Richard, as the company's manager, had lost everything, while Sarah's father managed to recover after the collapse. This revelation left her utterly stunned. What had initially appeared to be just a scheme for money now revealed itself to be a quest for a deeply rooted revenge. Richard blamed her father for the bankruptcy of the company and for the devastating losses he had suffered during that time. He had harbored that deep-seated resentment for years, and when he learned of the death of Sarah's father and of her own recent widowhood, he saw the perfect opening for his revenge. He orchestrated a plan to get close to Sarah, coldly calculating every step to infiltrate her life and destroy not only her fortune, but also the very family her father had left behind. From the very beginning, Richard had approached her with the singular, clear intention of getting his revenge. The marriage, the promises of care and affection, were all just part of an elaborate charade to exact vengeance on the man he believed had destroyed his financial future. In his eyes, Sarah and Emily were merely symbols of the injustice he'd carried since the company's collapse. With this horrifying revelation, Sarah felt a tidal wave of both rage and profound sorrow. Richard had not only deceived her, but he had also manipulated her deepest grief, turning her own vulnerability into a weapon for his personal vendetta. Everything she had believed to be real, the love he professed to have for her, the tender care he always seemed to show. It was nothing more than a facade, one that was meticulously constructed. He had used her as a pawn in a game of revenge against a man who was no longer even alive. As the police investigation moved forward, Sarah discovered even more. The police had successfully captured Richard's accomplice, a former business colleague who had assisted him in tampering with the brakes on Sarah's car. Together, they had planned the accident in a cold and calculated manner, certain that everything would look like a tragic coincidence. The evidence they found, along with the testimony from the accomplice, made it clear that Richard didn't just want the money. He also wanted to make her pay an emotional price for what he considered an old debt. He was prepared to destroy the lives of Sarah and her daughter in the most brutal way possible, just to feel avenged. For Sarah, the weight of this betrayal landed in an even more devastating way. It wasn't just greed that motivated him, but a visceral hatred fueled by years of resentment. To know that she and her daughter had been the targets of such cruelty, and that the pain Richard inflicted was rooted in something so dark and distant. Events she never even knew had taken place, made her question the very fabric of her life with him. Every gesture, every word, every moment they had shared now felt twisted by the dark truth she had finally uncovered. Taking a deep breath, Sarah closed the file, her hands trembling with the weight of it all. The discovery brought her a terrifying new clarity. Although the fear and trauma still lingered, she now understood the full extent of the danger she had escaped. Richard wasn't just greedy. He was driven by a blinding desire for vengeance, a profound hatred that had made him a truly dangerous man. Knowing he was in prison offered some relief, but the revelation also made her realize just how vital it was to protect Emily from any shadow the past could still cast upon their lives. Now, with the entire truth exposed, Sarah knew her real journey was only just beginning. The trauma Richard left behind would be hard to erase, but with this newfound, her perspective was clearer than ever before, certain that the life she would rebuild with Emily would be founded on genuine love, on truth, and on the strength of the unbreakable bond between a mother and her daughter. As time went on, Sarah and Emily finally began to heal from the trauma Richard had inflicted upon their lives. Now, free from his shadow, they moved forward with their lives, never looking back, rebuilding their world with love, strength, and the certainty that the worst was finally over. And so concludes the story of Sarah and Emily, who together conquered every challenge life threw their way. So, what about you? What did you think of this video? If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button and share your thoughts down in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on any new stories. Until next time, M.